making me excited now. I'm like, oh my God, yes, we can have pop-up dinners, we can have like massive celebrations. What would be amazing is also to have community fridges so people can have access to fresh, tasty, healthy food, you know? No, but I think that's the thing, actually, is like when you have an idea and you put it out there to the universe and you start seeing people responding to it positively, I feel like that is a God-ordained fucking idea.
After years of legal battles, political negotiations, and fierce protests from activist groups, an agreement has finally been reached on the reparations to compensate for colonial exploitation, human trafficking, and slavery. We, a group of visionary artists, curators, and creatives, have decided to invest our share of the payment in a unique project, the Museum of Black Futures. My name is Richard Kofi, co-founder and director of the museum, and I'm taking you on this journey. In 2021, actually, the museum started as a dream. Shout out to co-founder Simone Zeefuik. And we started to build a creative community through workshops, residencies, and lively discussions. And with this episode, I'd like to introduce you to one of our amazing contributors, Lelani Lewis. Lelani Lewis, a chef, food stylist and culinary activist. Growing up in South London with Grenadian and Irish heritage, she became obsessed with the idea of creating a mainstream platform for Caribbean food, modernizing it and making it more accessible. We're going to talk a little bit about time travel, celebration and Black joy. But also, I wanted to announce that Lelani is going to be the museum's food programmer.
Yes. Oh my God, you've just coached me as well. Now I know what I am. I'm a food programmer.
Very much so. Well, we know each other through your Côte Noire food experiences. I've been a part of a couple of them as a visitor, but also we collaborated together on the Zuidas, kind of the business district of Amsterdam, where we did a pretty interesting intervention, actually, in the kind of ways of working of that area by doing one of your experiences there. It's highly controversial, the name, the concept, but what I really appreciate about you is that you're willing to kind of unpack every thought experiment, crazy idea that you come across, kind of experiment with it, let the idea run through your mind before judging it or kind of shoving it to the side, which always creates these lovely conversations. So what I wanted to ask you is, how did you come up with Côte Noire? And can you tell us a little bit about the journey that you're on, kind of starting from moving to Amsterdam to becoming the the food programmer of the Museum of Black Futures?
Yeah. As I said, when I moved to Amsterdam, well, nearly 10 years ago now, so I should really be doing this in Dutch, but actually you said it's going to be on an English platform, so it's fine. Yay! I got a good get out of jail card free there. I when I moved here, I was feeling homesick, unanchored, and then I realized that actually one way I could connect back to my roots was through my dad's cuisine. And my dad is from Grenada. And I was going to all of these tocos and seeing like similar products, and also, why is that called a Madame Jeanette when it's a pimento pepper, or that's an adjuma and it's a Scotch bonnet? So these familiar ingredients that had completely different names. And I realized that was like kind of an anchor for me to get to know myself a bit better. And I kind of went down a rabbit hole of research. And one of the books I came across was a book by Jessica B. Harris. She's an amazing author, was a lecturer. She has written, I think, an insane amount of books, maybe over 10 books on African and Caribbean foodways. And And I came across this manuscript called the Code Noir. And I was like, what is that? It sounds intriguing. And then went down another rabbit hole, as you do when you're researching and you're really interested in a subject, and found out that it was a manuscript written by Louis XIV. And it was a manuscript detailing how enslaved Africans should be kept in the French colonies, but also detailing how the Jews should be expelled from Europe and should convert to Christianity. So it was a really demoralizing, dehumanizing document. And then there's silence because it's like, why on earth would you call your book after such a... Yeah. And I think it was just because I felt that so often with Black history, no matter what it, you know, whether it's African, whatever the diaspora is all the focus is so much tends to be on the victimization of those people. And I just thought to myself, you know what? I'm going to take this name and I'm going to invert its meaning. I'm going to say, you know what? This is a tragic document. It's quite monstrous, actually, because it details things like if an enslaved African were to try and escape, what their punishments would be, if how much grams of food should a man, woman, or child have, you know, really dehumanizing stuff. And I just thought, you know, actually, why can't we take something, invert the meaning, reverse it, and actually talk about the fact that, oh my God, despite all of these atrocities and adversities, we were able to overcome and create the most spectacular cuisine. And look at how vibrant and joyous, you know, Caribbean culture is. So actually, again, it was just a way for me to just re-own a narrative which is usually imposed on us.
I love that, Lelani. And what I wanted to start off with was that in a previous episode with Pati Anahuri, a wonderful architect and artist and researcher from Cabo Verde, mentioned that how important it is to have these smells in the room, to have a museum also think of smells as something to collect, and therefore there must be cooking, and therefore there might have to be a garden or some sort of an ecosystem for these smells to be part of the museum experience. And that's what I wanted to unpack with you. What do you think of that idea? And can you maybe expand a little bit on it? Because this really is your specialty.
Yeah, well, of course. I'm like now imagining a museum that always has like this kind of like heavy air of smells of the food cooking, which can be probably a bit obnoxious, but also kind of be evocative of home. I think food in Black culture and in many cultures is just so important because of that the fact that it evokes emotions and memories and nostalgia. And I think that can either be good or bad in some cases, but it's very important. And for me, you know, working with food is not just about bringing tasty food to people. It's about helping them to understand how connected we are via the food that we eat, and using it as a tool of connection. And yeah, that's super imperative. That all of my work basically shows that the transcendental nature of food, basically.
Can your practice be seen as or interpreted as futuristic?
I think it's futuristic in the sense that despite the fact that I look back at history and historical recipes, that I'm also looking at how mutable these cuisines have always been. And somehow we now have these very kind of fixed ideas about what cultural cuisine is or what different cultural cuisines are. You know, jollof has to be this way, has to be cooked this way, but then another culture cooks it slightly differently. And I think food has always been adapted through time and the availability of different ingredients there. So I think in that sense, it's like the evolvement. Like what I like to show people is the evolvement of cuisines and the evolvement of recipes. And I think in that sense, it's futuristic because it basically it removes borders.
Yeah. I like that. Yeah, so we're collecting smells, but we're also collecting objects. So we could see or interpret food or certain ingredients as something that is fit for the collection. Do you have any ingredients that hold such symbolic weight that it could be or should be collected at the Museum of Black Futures?
Well, last year, actually, I did I curated a food night at the Het Schepvaart Museum here in Amsterdam. And basically, I wanted to focus on, global food systems. And one of the ingredients I wanted to focus on, and decolonizing the food system, basically. And one of the ingredients I decided to put like a kind of more of a microscopic view upon was the cassava. And just as a way of creating a easier red thread through the story, because of course, if you're looking at global food systems and decolonizing it, it's such a huge kind of outwards view on things that you need something to kind of give specificity to it. So we were looking at cassava and looking at how basically every single continent had some kind of part in growing it or processing it or using it in foods. So for example, in Taiwan, bubble tea is super popular. And that uses tapioca starch to make the bubbles. And then obviously it's one of the most eaten root vegetables in the continent of Africa. And one of the great things about cassava is that it is quite a future-proof tuber in the sense that it's quite drought resistant. It can be grown with very little sun, etc., etc. And so I think it's really interesting looking at some of these indigenous. Well, actually, cassava is not indigenous to Africa; it's indigenous to South America. But looking at some of these vegetables, which basically are going to be resistant to the future proofing of climate change. And so something like that, which was already in the past seen as, it used to be called a staff of life in South America. When Columbus arrived on Hispaniola, he basically was given cassava or cassave, cassava bread. And it got called the bread of the conquest as it was crossed over between the Atlantic and back from the Americas over to Europe. And so I think like something that's as culturally significant from one continent to another, and actually basically most of the continents, is an ingredient that we can see as not just taking us from the past and its past significance, but also its potential future significance to our diets, you know? Whereas some other staples that we've become so reliant on, potatoes, for example, might not be able to last the climate fluctuations that we're going to be experiencing in the future. Something as synonymous to the African continent and South America could be this new staff of life.
A staff of life that projects us into the future. I like that. Your story got me thinking about repatriation, a way of giving back stolen cultural heritage. And I'd like to unpack something because in a previous episode, again, I mentioned this term rematriation. This concept thinks beyond the transaction that repatriation kind of embodies, right? That giving back of an object. But this also focuses on creating a spiritual context for the object and a ceremonial basis for the object to kind of return on. And it's a process that also honors the spirit of the community that is left behind, because it's also recognizing the amazing work indigenous communities have done to maintain their structure, their culture, and their spiritual togetherness, despite the fact that that these objects have been taken from them, that they've been taken from these processes, and that they've found new ways to reconnect to each other and to make new innovations on a spiritual and communal level. So when an object returns, it's not going to disrupt the thing or the society that people have created since it left, because it's also kind of doing the work towards the indigenous communities for paving the way spiritually, as we called it last episode. And this is a long introduction to a sort of a question, because your practice, aren't you inspiring us diaspora kids to psychologically go on a similar journey? Aren't you kind of using food to bring us back to our connection to the land, to our native soil?
Was there a question in there? No, I'm joking. Of course. I mean, 100%. I mean, this journey with looking back at, the culinary history of the Caribbean was actually a selfish journey in the sense that it was about kind of reconciling my dual heritage, trying to find myself again, because I'd moved to Amsterdam from London and had kind of lost who I was. So looking back on that helped me reconcile with myself again and understand that actually so many different cultures can come together and create something else. And in that sense, I guess that was me. Yeah, I was the actual materialization of that. But, what I did come across is that, obviously, there's no way of looking back at the culinary history of the Caribbean without coming across colonialism. And I think it's good for the Museum of Black Futures to also get past that. But we cannot underestimate the impacts that it's had. I always call colonialism like this, one of history's biggest PR campaign. And it was a PR campaign that managed to sweep into it philosophy, theology, pseudoscience, to be able to prove that basically the cultures that they subjugated and tried to dominate were lesser. And within that was the erasure of the contributions of those cultures. And one thing that I've come across of late was looking at African rice, or I've written it down because I can never remember the name, erasure grabarima. And so this rice was like an indigenous rice to West Africa and brought over in the hair of enslaved West African women. They would cane row it into their hair. And I feel like and then not only would they cane roll it into their hair and then bring it across the Atlantic to some of the plantations, not only in the Caribbean, but also in the American South, those economies grew from the very back of those rice grains. And it wasn't just the grains themselves, it was the understanding of the agriculture and how to grow that rice, that these women brought over with them, that was used, propagated, and then taken advantage of, essentially. So we think about like some of these Western societies, these great powers that actually were quite literally built off not just our backs, not just our manual labor, but also our technology, our innovations, our brain power as well. And so for me, bringing back like talking about Caribbean food and giving it a sense of pride, really making people see, like, look at the contributions that we have made. Look at these underappreciated cuisines that, actually have been born from sometimes adverse conditions and are super creative, like the most creative. And let's give them some sense of pride, not only for other people to experience, but also giving us pride back in ourselves, So I see that as an act of resistance, actually.
And how does that contribute to the decolonization of food systems?
I don't know. How long have you got, man? I've given you snacks and tea, and I mean, the whole decolonization thing within the food industry is absolutely huge. It isn't just about the philosophy behind regaining value back over the cuisines, but it is quite literally the way that colonial European capitalist powers have learned to propagate our food, or to basically, retrieve our food, which is extremely extractive and exploitative of land, of people, of the planet. And I feel like that's why we're in this mess in the first place. You can't look at these things and not connect them and connect the dots, basically. So unless we start thinking about ways in which we can maybe go back to more indigenous ways of growing our food, which are a bit more symbiotic with the planet, it's more life affirming, life giving back rather than taking, then I think we're just going to keep on going down this path of self-destruction, basically. So there's a lot to be said about how we can use food to educate ourselves on not only decolonizing our food system, but also creating a better future for ourselves in the sense of how we live, in commune with our planet, basically.
So the Museum of Black Futures also needs a garden where we can grow our own produce for our collection management of the smells, of course.
Oh my God. What a dream. What a dream. I mean, decolonizing food is also about how you grow it. So that would be incredible. One of the other things I've been thinking about is part of our unfair and unequal ways that the food system shows up nowadays is the unfair access to food. And so, when you think of about that, you probably think of like non-Western cultures not having, but it also includes cities and food deserts and places that don't have, and people who don't have access to affordable, healthy food. So as well as having an amazing garden with like indigenous free sisters knowledge on how to work with, crops that work symbiotically with one another, what would be amazing is also to have community fridges so people can have access to fresh, tasty, healthy food, I think sometimes, especially in cities, what happens within these food deserts is that people are infiltrated with really healthy, bad food that then creates health problems in the future, So, and that's systematic. That's not done, not on purpose,
So if you really want our museum to really make an impact, not only in decolonial terms, but also kind of looking at the health and the well-being and the spiritual balance of our communities, actually, and the people that we're reaching out to. It's good to address the food systems and the health aspect of that, but I kind of want to move the conversation also towards joy. The joy of having a garden, the joy of communing, of getting together, of eating together. Can you unpack a little bit or tell us a little bit about what that aspect means to you and your practice and your vision for our museum?
I mean, actually, like the biggest act of resistance, I keep on talking about acts of resistance, but the biggest act of resistance is building communities, right? Like there's so much power in us as a collective, and yet actually we've moved so far away from the collective into a kind of false narrative about individualism, and that doesn't help anybody. So I feel like, the Museum of, you're making me excited now. I'm like, oh my God, yes, we can have pop-up dinners. We can have like massive celebrations. Because for me, I think the reason why I love food so much and it's become part of my lifeblood is because of the fact that my dad had 11 brothers and sisters. So family gatherings and food for me, I've completely associated it with joy, community, celebration. And so I can't separate the two. So I think it's incredible to think of a future with that, people being able to commune around food, because actually it's so universal. I could sit next to someone who I don't even speak the same language with and share a good meal, and we could just nod at each other, appreciating the food. So I'm here. I'm down. I'm ready for the programming of this museum. The food programming, I'm there.
Yeah. Everything you're saying is making me so happy, Lelani. It's thank you for sharing so much and for being so generous in your answers. And I want to touch upon maybe a touchy subject, and it has to do with identification in relationship to joy, because we are both of mixed heritage. You grew up in Great Britain. I grew up here. So I bet that some of our narratives are fairly different. And that's maybe our relationship to blackness as well. I was raised by both my parents, but my father really drilled into me that I have to be black and proud, that I'm black, and also this thing of the Museum of Black Futures is also kind of honoring the black futurists that have influenced the concept of this and the conceptual framework of it, and the fight for liberation that is at the basis of the need for this museum to happen. So that's why it's Black Futures and not just the Museum of Futures. And of course, I identify as that. So when we're talking about joy, you're talking about the family gatherings, the impact that your father made on you. I had the similar experience. But what does Black joy mean to you? How do you relate to the term Black joy? How do you see yourself in that movement?
I think being mixed race, if you're asking me about Black joy, it makes me feel a bit uncomfortable, in the sense of like, can I really speak on that? Like, I can, as in my whole life, I've been told this narrative of you're not Black enough to really constitute being Black, but you're not white enough. And then also my dad basically socializing us to say, when you go out into the world as a mixed race person, nobody's going to see the whiteness in you. They're only going to see a brown girl. So just be comfortable with that. So I do feel a little bit uncomfortable speaking on Black joy because of that. But then at the same time, even the answer within itself, I think, says a lot, right? I think Black joy is basically to live without the constraints of those dichotomies of who we should and shouldn't be, and being able to live free, free from, these ideas that are put onto us about who we are and who we should be, and just being unconstrained, basically, unrestrained. And I think that's Black joy.
I love it. Well, this is it, Lelani. Thank you so much.
I'm going to be the food curator, right? You're employing me. This is just note, this is an informal contract. Informal contract. Employing.
You're very much aware of it.
No, but I think that's the thing, actually, is like when you have an idea and you put it out there to the universe and you start seeing people responding to it positively, I feel like that is a God-ordained fucking idea. Yeah. Because if people take to it, there's something there and you just need to create the momentum for it. It will happen.